Steve Martin. The silver-haired comedian who made millions laugh with his absurdist humor, slapstick timing, and unforgettable roles in classics like The Jerk, Father of the Bride, and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. For decades, audiences have adored him as a man who radiates charm, wit, and effortless comedy. But behind the twinkle in his eye and that ever-present banjo, Hollywood insiders whisper a very different story. A story not of laughter, but of rivalries, and even hatred. Because Steve Martin, like every giant in the entertainment industry, wasn't immune to clashes with his peers. Fame is a competitive arena, and when you place strong egos, creative genius, and fragile pride on the same stage, sparks are bound to fly. And Steve Martin had his fair share of battles. Some of these were playful rivalries that audiences mistook for friendships. Others, however, were bitter conflicts that Steve carried for years, even as he kept a smile on his face in public. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on Steve Martin's most shocking feuds. From legendary comedians who clashed with his style to unexpected friends who secretly became rivals, this list reveals the 7 actors Steve Martin supposedly hated the most. And let me warn you right now, number 2 on this list will leave you stunned, because it's someone the world always thought was his closest ally. So grab your popcorn, because what you're about to hear may change the way you look at Steve Martin forever. This isn't just the story of a comedy legend. It's the untold story of his grudges, rivalries, and the enemies he never wanted you to know about. Steve Martin has always been celebrated for his clean-cut charm, his sharp wit, and his ability to make audiences laugh without ever needing to dip into vulgarity or shock. His brand of comedy was absurdist, intelligent, and often surreal. For years, he was considered the gentleman of comedy, but even a gentleman can have enemies. Behind closed doors, Steve carried grudges, frustrations, and rivalries that very few people outside the entertainment industry knew about. In Hollywood, friendships can be fragile, and competition runs deep. Actors and comedians aren't just entertainers. They're also products fighting for the same spotlight. And when Steve Martin's star rose in the 1970s and 80s, it didn't rise alone. It collided with other giants of comedy, men whose egos were just as large, and whose desire for recognition often clashed with Steve's. The first on our list of actors Steve Martin reportedly couldn't stand is none other than Chevy Chase. At first glance, the two had a lot in common. Both were white-hot comedy stars of the 1970s, both known for their deadpan humor, and both broke out of television into massive film careers. But their similarities may have been exactly what drove them apart. Chevy Chase came out of Saturday Night Live as one of its biggest breakout stars, becoming Hollywood's go-to leading man for quirky comedies. Meanwhile, Steve Martin was dominating the stand-up circuit with sold-out shows and building his own path into film. What should have been a natural camaraderie between two comedy titans quickly soured into a clash of egos. Industry insiders described their relationship as a quiet rivalry. Chevy, who had a reputation for arrogance even among his SNL castmates, allegedly dismissed Steve's stand-up style as gimmicky and overblown. He supposedly believed that Martin's brand of comedy relied too heavily on absurd props and surreal gags rather than real improvisational skill. Steve, in return, reportedly found Chevy condescending and mean-spirited, especially toward other comedians. One story that often resurfaces involves a Hollywood party where Chevy and Steve were both in attendance. Chevy is said to have made a sarcastic comment about Steve's balloon animals and banjo routines, mocking his live performances. Steve, normally calm and collected, didn't laugh. Instead, he walked away visibly irritated. That moment marked the beginning of years of quiet disdain. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, it extended onto the screen as well. When casting, directors were looking for comedy leads. Steve and Chevy were often on the same shortlists. Both men had similar appeal, charming, quirky, and bankable. But where Steve brought warmth and intelligence to his roles, Chevy often leaned into arrogance, and slapstick. The contrast meant that Hollywood frequently compared them, and comparison breeds resentment. Over time, Chevy's career began to decline, while Steve's remained strong and steady. Yet the tension between them was never fully resolved. To this day, those who worked with them in the 70s and 80s recall the friction as something more than simple competition. It was personal. And so, Chevy Chase takes the number 7 spot on our list. A feud born not out of scandal or betrayal, but out of the simple fact that two men couldn't stand sharing the same comedic kingdom. But Chevy was just the beginning. Because while Martin could shrug off arrogance, the next rivalry on our list cut deeper. It was with a man who brought chaos wherever he went, a man whose unpredictable style clashed with Steve's precise comedic timing. That man was none other than Robin Williams. After Chevy Chase, Steve Martin's next feud was with someone who couldn't have been more different. If Chevy represented arrogance and smug superiority, Robin Williams was the opposite: manic energy, improvisational brilliance, and an endless stream of chaotic genius. On the surface, Steve and Robin respected each other, even shared stages and late-night show couches. But behind the scenes, Steve had his frustrations, and they all revolved around Robin's unpredictable style. Steve Martin was a perfectionist. His stand-up routines were meticulously crafted, every pause rehearsed, every joke polished until it gleamed. Robin, on the other hand, thrived on improvisation. He would walk into a room, explode into a whirlwind of impressions, voices, and physical comedy and leave everyone breathless. Audiences adored it, but Steve saw it differently. To him, Robin's chaotic energy felt undisciplined, like noise rather than art. There are stories from charity performances in the 1980s where Steve and Robin shared the stage. Martin would carefully set up a routine, only for Robin to swoop in with an improvised tangent that stole the spotlight. Audiences roared with laughter, but Steve, according to insiders, quietly fumed. Ones were about something more dangerous: power. By the 1980s, Steve was no longer just a rising comedian. He was a bona fide Hollywood star. That meant his rivals weren't just stealing stage time or disrupting sketches. They were battling him for the same crown, the king of comedy, and no one embodied that battle more fiercely than Bill Murray. Bill Murray was already known for his temper and difficult personality on sets. Colleagues described him as brilliant but combative, magnetic, yet mercurial. For Steve Martin, who valued professionalism, working around Bill was exhausting. Their paths crossed at industry events, charity shows, and within overlapping comedy circles, and tensions followed wherever they met. According to one insider, Steve and Bill once nearly got into a shouting match backstage at a comedy benefit. The argument reportedly stemmed from Bill mocking Steve's calculated comedy style, sneering that Martin's jokes felt like homework. Steve didn't back down. He fired back that Bill's grumpy act was just another gimmick. The two were separated before things escalated further, but the icy tension remained. It wasn't that Steve didn't respect Bill Murray's talent. He did. But the problem was simple. Both men wanted to be the alpha in the room. And in comedy, there's rarely room for two alphas. That ongoing power struggle cements Bill Murray at number 4 on our list. But if Murray was difficult, the next feud was deeper. Richard Pryor, the groundbreaking comedian whose raw, confessional style revolutionized stand-up, clashed with Steve Martin on a philosophical level. Pryor was everything Steve wasn't: gritty, unfiltered, and willing to expose his darkest truths on stage. His comedy was about pain, race, addiction, and the chaos of life itself. Steve, by contrast, leaned into the absurd, silly props, surreal scenarios, and safe, family-friendly jokes. The two respected each other's fame, but reportedly dismissed each other's artistry. Steve once implied in an interview that shock comedy wasn't real craft, a comment many thought was a veiled jab at Pryor. Meanwhile, Pryor is rumored to have laughed off Steve's clean-cut act as comedy for tourists. Behind the scenes, the two men rarely spoke, and when they did, sparks flew. The rivalry wasn't explosive in the sense of fights or public outbursts. It was colder than that. It was mutual disdain, and that makes Pryor a solid number 3 on Steve's list of most hated actors. But if fans might have expected Martin to clash with wild cards like Murray and Pryor, no one could have predicted the name sitting at number 2. Because number 2 wasn't a rival, it was a friend. At least, that's what audiences thought. The shocking reveal is Martin Short. Yes, Martin Short, Steve Martin's frequent co-star, longtime collaborator, and the man fans believed was his comedic soulmate. Together, they starred in Three Amigos, and later toured as a comedy duo, appearing inseparable in interviews and late-night shows. But behind the laughter, insiders claim, was tension. The problem? Jealousy. While Steve often played the straight man, Martin Short's characters stole the spotlight with their exaggerated, over-the-top energy. Producers loved it, audiences loved it, and Steve, according to whispers, resented it. He reportedly felt that Short's scene-stealing antics made him look flat, especially when they performed together live. Some even say their friendship was partly a performance, a convenient alliance that kept both men relevant. Offstage, Steve allegedly grew tired of Short's constant energy and need for attention. The two would bicker about creative direction during tours, with Steve wanting more control while Short leaned into improvisation. The irony is hard to ignore. The man audiences believed was Steve Martin's closest friend may, in fact, have been one of his greatest rivals. And that's why Martin Short takes the shocking number 2 spot. But if number 2 stunned you, wait until you hear about number 1. Because the actor Steve Martin reportedly hated the most wasn't a collaborator or a supposed friend. It was a man whose words cut deeper than any rival's actions. Eddie Murphy. At the top of our list sits the actor Steve Martin reportedly hated more than anyone else. And unlike the other rivalries, which were born out of creative clashes, egos, or competition, this one came down to words, sharp, cutting words that struck at the very heart of Steve's identity as a comedian. That actor was none other than Eddie Murphy. By the mid-1980s, Eddie Murphy was the hottest star in Hollywood. Coming out of Saturday Night Live and launching into blockbuster hits like Beverly Hills Cop and Trading Places, Eddie was unstoppable. He was young, brash, and unapologetically raw. His comedy was the complete opposite of Steve Martin's carefully constructed absurdism. Where Steve played with banjos and balloons, Eddie stormed onto the stage with swagger, profanity, and razor-sharp cultural observations. And Eddie didn't hold back his opinions. In interviews, he was known to take shots at other comedians he considered outdated or irrelevant. Unfortunately for Steve, he became one of Eddie's targets. According to industry chatter, Eddie once dismissed Steve Martin's comedy as too safe and too white bread. He supposedly joked that Steve's routines were what your parents would laugh at when they didn't want to feel edgy. The jab spread through Hollywood like wildfire, and Steve, who prided himself on being innovative, took it personally. For Steve, it wasn't just an insult, it was a dismissal of his entire legacy. He had built his career on being different, on breaking away from traditional punchline-based comedy and creating something surreal and new. To have Eddie reduce it to safe cut deeply. The tension between them never fully cooled. While they rarely worked together directly, they circled the same Hollywood orbit, attending the same award shows and industry events. Insiders say that whenever Eddie Murphy was in the room, Steve Martin kept his distance. The animosity was palpable, even if unspoken. What made it worse was the contrast in their careers. In the 1980s, Eddie Murphy dominated the box office. While Steve's film choices were hit or miss, the comparisons were unavoidable. And each comparison reminded Steve of Eddie's biting words. But here's the twist. While Eddie may have dismissed Steve, Steve also dismissed Eddie. Privately, Steve reportedly referred to Murphy's comedy as cheap laughs, suggesting that Eddie relied too heavily on shock and profanity rather than true comedic craft. He once implied that comedians like Murphy burn bright and fast, while his own comedy was built to last. The rivalry between Steve Martin and Eddie Murphy was never reconciled. Unlike his grudges with Robin Williams or Bill Murray, which sometimes softened over time, the rift with Eddie was permanent. Two comedy legends, representing two entirely different eras and styles, locked in a silent feud that shaped how each was remembered. And so Eddie Murphy takes the #1 spot on this list, the actor Steve Martin reportedly hated the most. But what does this tell us about Steve Martin himself? In the end, Steve's rivalries reflect more than just personal grudges. They reveal the nature of comedy itself, a battlefield of egos, philosophies, and styles. For every laugh shared with an audience, there's often a rivalry simmering behind. The scenes. Steve Martin built his career on making the world laugh. Yet behind the curtain, he was as human as anyone else, jealous, frustrated, competitive, and sometimes bitter. His feuds remind us that even the funniest people carry their own darkness, and maybe that's the real truth about Steve Martin. Comedy, for him, wasn't just about joy, it was also about survival. In a world where laughter is power, enemies are inevitable, and Steve